This is the Dark Illumination Report podcast for Saturday, August 8th, 2020. On today's episode, I'm going to be answering a question from Jessica who asked, do I have any good books on the Yezidis that I can recommend?
This is a Dark Illumination Report Extra with RJ Womack.
Howdy, everybody. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, Brother Nero, aka RJ Womack, and this is the Dark Illumination Report podcast, the podcast where we promote the serious religious worship of Satan and demons as a way of life. And we try to pass these ideas on to young diabolists. So today I'm going to be answering a question that comes from Jessica, but before I get into that, I want to mention a few things and kind of add some things to the previous podcast that I forgot to mention. The first thing I want to tell you is that because of you guys, this audience keeps growing and growing and growing. We've tripled our audience since all the black metal kids kind of left this podcast behind after I said I wasn't going to be a theistic Satanist anymore. And I thought for sure that we were always going to have a small audience, but our audience keeps growing and growing and growing. And I think that's has a lot to do with you guys, because I have a feeling a lot of you are out there promoting this podcast like I ask you to. And I really appreciate that, because let's face it, guys, without the audience, the podcast host and the podcast doesn't really mean a whole lot, does it? If nobody's listening, it doesn't really matter what you say. So I really appreciate your support and input and your encouragement and all your emails. And I really do appreciate it. And I don't take any of you for granted. And even though some of you have been writing to me and haven't heard from me, it's because I've been working on my book and I've been working on it very hard. So I've been really busy with that. And I'll have a few announcements with regard to my new book shortly. And I think you'll be very happy with what I have to say. We'll also be doing some things on this podcast that I think you'll be happy about as well. I also want to let you know that according to Simon, this is our 100th video on YouTube. Now, I was not aware of this because, believe it or not, I don't keep up with my podcast, and so I really don't promote this podcast the way that I should. It's one of the reasons why the podcast is not as well known as it could be. But funny enough, Simon is one of our regular listeners, and he actually knows more about my podcast than I do. So good on you, Simon. Maybe you should be the producer of the podcast. You said that you kind of want to volunteer and you want to help out. You seem to like the podcast and you seem to care more about the numbers we're hitting, and you keep giving me ideas for the podcast. So maybe you should volunteer as the producer of the show and help me promote it. Anyway, yeah, I just think it's funny, and I really appreciate Simon's input. I mean, I don't want to make light of him and I don't want to make fun of him, because really it is funny, but it's also greatly appreciated, the support and the suggestions, even though I don't always take them on board or don't always respond to his email. I always read what he has to say because he's so passionate about it. And I appreciate that. I appreciate anybody who cares about what I'm doing, because sometimes it's very hard to get the motivation to continue when you don't feel like you're making a difference. And you guys have proven to me that I am making a difference and that this podcast really does matter to you. So I really appreciate that. Now, before I get into Jessica's question, I want to address something that I was talking about on the previous episode yesterday, which is the angels and demons issue. Now, as I said yesterday, I don't claim to be a guru. I don't claim to know everything there is to know about angels and demons. I'm not trying to claim to be, some kind of fucking messiah or something. I'm just telling you, based on what I've experienced, based on what I know my friends have experienced, I can tell you that every experience we've ever had with any entity that refers to itself as an angel, it is negative. They do not like Satan. They do not like Satanists, and they will do nasty things to you. And that's just the fact. Now, if somebody else has had different experiences, that's fine, but I can only go on what I've experienced. And what I've experienced is that any entity that identifies itself, and that's a clear distinction. I'm not identifying these spirits as angelic. They identify themselves as angelic. And every experience that I've had with them has been bad, really bad. So I wouldn't advise working with them if you're a Satanist, especially if you're really dedicated to Satan and you really mean what you say and you have kept the promises you've made to him, because angelic spirits don't like him and they don't like you. Trust me. That's why when I hear people say that they work with angels and demons and have had no issues at all, I question whether they're real occultists, whether they really practice, or they're just a bunch of hacks writing books to sell to people. That's what I ask myself, because I just don't buy it. It doesn't match up with what my experience has been, and it doesn't match up with what the experiences of people I know have been. And either that or they're not really Satanist. One of the two. It's either they're not really practicing and they're just making shit up, or they're not really dedicated Satanists, so the angelic spirits don't care what they do and they don't care about working with them or whatever because they're not really dedicated to Satan. It's got to be one of the two. Both things can't be true. Let me move on to Jessica's question, who asked, do I have any books about the Yezidis that I can recommend? And the honest answer is no, Jessica, because I haven't really read any books on the Yezidis in about a decade. And at the time, there wasn't many real good books about them. But since then, it's been more than a decade, actually. But since then, they've developed their own website and they have their own official website. Plus, they've been in the news a lot more because their women have been sold into sex slavery by ISIS. And the news media has been reporting on them for the last couple of years. So I'm sure there are books either in the works or books that have just been released that go into the details about their beliefs. And as far as whether people should talk about their belief in Satan or talk about the Al-Jawar or not, I think that admonition from Satan was for the Yezidis themselves, and they kind of broke his suggestion or his admonition. They kind of went against it, and they opened up their society and their community to outsiders, and they revealed the essence of their religion in many ways to outsiders. Not everything, but they revealed a lot of stuff, and I think that's why they're being persecuted by the members of ISIS and by Christians in the past. And that's why their women are abused, and that's why their men are killed, because Satan knew that if they revealed themselves to be different in that part of the world, they were going to die. And they chose not to listen to him. And sometimes when you choose not to listen to him, it's not that Satan punishes you for what you do. It's that he, the natural consequences of not listening to him are you're going to have bad things happen to you. I mean, you can't honestly say or expect to say that you worship the devil in the Middle East and not expect to be murdered and killed in a primarily Islamic area. It just doesn't make sense. And that area has been Islamic for a long time. So, I mean, there's no reason why the Yezidis should have opened themselves up to the outsiders. There's no reason why they should have exposed themselves to that kind of hostility, but they did. And now they're suffering with the consequences of those actions. But anyway, like I said, you should be able to find some good books, or should be able to find some soon, Jessica. And if any of you listeners know of any books that you can recommend to Jessica, just write me an email and let me know, and I'll be glad to pass it on to her. And as always, you can always make comments at the bottom of the video, and Jessica will see them because she makes comments on the YouTube videos. So if you leave some comments for her, I'm sure she'll read them herself. But anyway, that's it for today, guys. I hope it's helped somebody. As always, may Satan be with you. Thank you for listening. Remember to promote the podcast to anyone you think might be interested. Thank you again. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Dark Illumination Report podcast. For the latest news headlines, show information, and more, go to rjwomack.com. That's rjwomack.com.